have my book. I'm ready to begin. This is one of my favourite moments. I guess that's obvious. Everybody's going to like this time when you pick up a book and you start to read. There's a sort of excitement about it, especially when it's a book that I'm going to talk about. Because when I record a video about a book, I'm doing a proper deep dive into it, and that's more exciting than just reading. It's a book I'm going to come to know very well. We're almost at chapter 1, but actually there's another preface first. There's the general preface of 1829, and I do want to cover that. So I'll just go straight in. I took some notes. So in this preface, Scott tells us how he came to write this book in the first place. He felt when he started writing this book, which was around 1804-ish, that English people didn't understand Scotland very well. In fact, that English people held rather derogatory views of Scotland and of Scottish people. So in this preface, he talks about that. He talks about how he came to fiction in the first place, because fiction was not a style of repute. In a way, it was like somebody with a lot of skills today choosing to spend his time playing computer games. That was how the world viewed fiction when Scott started writing. He feels he has a lot of explaining to do, given his respectability and authority in the world. So he talks about his childhood. He was born in Scotland and he spent some time at the edge of the Highlands. He came to love the place. He's listened to the stories, he's met the people, and he has seen the sights. Given that he's an educated man and a respectable one, he feels the need to explain why he has taken up this very dubious pastime. He talks about how, when he was 15 years old, he burst a blood vessel. Motion and speech were for a long time pronounced positively dangerous. For several weeks, I was confined strictly to my bed, during which time I was not allowed to speak above a whisper, to eat more than a spoonful or two of boiled rice, or to have more covering than one thin counterpane. To keep him still during this dangerous time, he was allowed to read whatever he wanted, as much as he liked. Romances of chivalry, the ponderous folios of Cyrus and Cassandra, down to the most approved works of later times. Old plays, epic poetry, all of these he read. After the bed rest, he was sent to the country to recover, and that is the Scottish country, where he was practically alone in an isolated cottage with a family member. At this time, he read some more. The cottage he was in had a very good library. After he exhausted all the sources of romantic fiction that he could find, romantic referring to imaginative fiction, not how we use the word today, he moved on to more educational material, including histories, memoirs, voyages and travels that were in the personal library of the home he was recuperating in. I said in my first video, at least I think that's where I said it, that Waverley struck me as a sort of self-insert character, which I don't actually see as detrimental. It's a logical starting point for any new writer. I feel like everybody should write one book where they are a self-insert. It helps you get the feel for the depth of character that you want to put into your stories, how you want to frame it, how everything can be set out. There's a lot of advantages to that. And if it's done well enough to publish, we can present our own type of person as a character to be understood. A lot of the reading I've done over the years has just been peopling my world with personality types that I've never actually met and are unlikely to meet. I'm perfectly happy to read a well-written self-insert. Where self-inserts go wrong is when they're not the self-insert as that person is now, but the self-insert as they want to be. So having said that, I notice now that Scott kind of admits it. The vague and wild use which I made of this advantage, that is, reading all the books he could find in this library, in this house he's in, I cannot describe better than by referring my reader to the desultory studies of Waverley in a similar situation, the passages concerning whose course of reading were initiated from recollections of my own. But, he continues, it must be understood that the resemblance extends no further. Walter Scott himself was never inveigled into any kind of treasonous activity, however innocently. So here he is, age 15, turning 16, convalescent in the Scottish Highlands, reading histories, memoirs, voyages and travels. This would be where he found the derogatory British views of Scotland. of the Scotland that he particularly loved himself. Those travel books were very big at the time. There was a large appetite for books about foreign countries. One common version was where an educated traveller would go overseas on a walking tour. They'd pick somewhere interesting, and every day they'd write a letter commenting on some facet of that community. It might be the manners of the people one day, the scenery another, their dress on a third day, local legends on a fourth. And then when they came home, they'd get all their letters published as a book of travels. A few of those publications might be genuine. This often happened posthumously, where the recipient of the letters commemorated their deceased relative by publishing their insightful account of their travels, but more often it was not. The letters were simply a framing device, and those authors chose their destination for the notoriety they could achieve. The more unusual the place, the more spectacular, the easier it was to find a publisher, the more likely they would actually get their book printed. These authors could be very derisive. They often sought out the most ridiculous aspects of a culture. Or sometimes they'd obtained a publishing deal before they set out, and along the way they found it wasn't as much fun as they thought it was, or there was actually danger involved, or it was just harder travel than they expected, and they'd get to a certain point and just make it up. Scott clearly read some of these false accounts during his time of convalescence, mocking people for whom he had great respect. Because of those travel books and various other stories, English people believed that Scottish people had no technology whatsoever. To a modern reader, it probably sounds odd to hear him say that, because to us, no one in 1800 had any technology whatsoever, but they actually did. They had carriages with brakes, they had clocks, they had tinder boxes, weapons, irrigation systems, all that sort of stuff. And the general belief in England was that Scottish people didn't have these things, that they were effectively living wild among the trees, that they fought all the time, they drank all the time, and they didn't have proper clothes. So, Walter Scott's idea is, as he says in the preface, he's just going to show the Scottish people in a better light. People will find them relatable in a way they never have. Now, after 2 years, he was deemed sufficiently recovered to leave this rural place, and he was sent away to school to study for his profession. That's where he started writing his first book. He had a rough beginning. Having proceeded as far, I think, as the 7th chapter, I showed my work to a critical friend, whose opinion was unfavourable. After that he gave it up. His poetry was selling nicely by then. In fact, he was a very popular poet. He didn't want to risk his new popularity with a bad book. It was only when Maria Edgeworth achieved success with Castle Rackrent that he decided to come back to it. Now, regarding the rumours of Scottish people spending their time drinking, fighting and living among the trees, I've now got to the end of this book, and if that's what Scott set out to demonstrate, that they didn't do this, I feel that he failed. A great number of the people that our main character meets are actually heavy drinking men who do a lot of fighting, are inadequately clothed and live among the forests. But Scott also felt that you were missing the character of the Scottish people if that was all you saw. That part of the reason they live that way is that it's just not important to them. They have other nobler priorities, honour and refinement and education, everything you got in England that was truly of value. It just looked a bit different. In presenting this, he succeeds. So, this is really what the general preface is about. All this background, what inspired him, his progress in writing this book, and how he now feels. And knowing that was his objective, we can now turn to chapter 1. Chapter 1 actually reads like another preface. These days, you wouldn't have a chapter 1 like this. Scott agrees. He calls it introductory, and that makes a lot of sense. You might think there's a chapter 1 to follow, but there isn't. This leads into chapter 2. It's sort of my habit to talk about first lines. Because of the way Scott does this, I'll be talking about 2 first lines. The one for chapter 1 and the one for chapter 2 when we get to it. So, the first line of chapter 1 is, "The title of this work has not been chosen without the grave and solid deliberation which matters of importance demand from the prudent." There's a compelling start to a story. Draws you in, gives you a taste of the story to come, sets the theme. It's actually a bit of a shock. It not only does none of that, but the leap into meta detail is particularly jarring. I do wonder how many readers got this far, read that first line, and stopped. This is not representative of the story once we properly get into it. But this is representative of much fiction at the time. Scott was lacking confidence. He'd been told it was so bad he should give it up, and maybe someone had suggested that he change the title. As it was, he feels the need to tell us how long and hard he thought about the name, what else he considered, and why he discarded all those other possibilities. So, the title is Waverley or 'Tis 60 Years Since. And in this chapter 1, he splits that into the two bits. He spends a whole page telling us why he chose the surname Waverley for his main character and why he didn't choose a whole range of other possibilities. Because he wanted a name that was euphonic and yet dignified. He wanted a name that wasn't going to be associated with anything else. Any actual family, for example, any famous character in literature, a name that didn't seem to imply a particular merit, which was a thing people did in these days. They'd have a stoic man with a blank face and call him Mr. Stone, or a giggling damsel and call her Miss Chucklewit. So he wanted his main character portrayed accurately because in this world of blank covers and no blurbs, you could get a feel for the story ahead by the title of the book and the name of the main players. It has been suggested by other readers that Waverley indicated wavering, as in the family wavered in their politics and principles. This is possible. Our hero in this story certainly does a bit of that. And I guess the fortunes of the house as a whole, his ancestral line, I guess you could say that the fortunes wavered. They also tended to favour whoever was the resistance more than the one actually in power. But they didn't waver in their principles. These guys are upright and proud from the very beginning. And even though some of the family might have divergent politics, they stick to their own beliefs quite well. So Scott actually did something a bit daring by choosing to show the different sides the way he did in a more equal way. It wasn't pure nationalism that he was showing as the British government would have liked. He kind of showed that there are two sides to every story, really. And that was unusual for that time. I think, in a way, that made Waverley a very good choice of character. And I know I'm sort of jumping the gun here and nobody's read it, so nobody knows what sort of character Waverley is. I'm going to be commenting on him rather disparagingly at times. He's a very passive character, and it's difficult to write an adventure story with a passive character. That's what Scott has done. He has put a passive character in a whole lot of action and adventure. It's a tough call. It's a very tough call for your first book. He kind of maybe bit off more than he could chew with this one, although he did get some skills together through the writing of this. But in other ways, it probably saves the whole book because all these patriots that are going to read it who would otherwise be absolutely appalled at Edward Waverley wandering into the regions he's wandering into and getting embroiled in things that he had no business getting embroiled in. They can understand because he's such a passive character, because he's so unsuspicious. He's just a puppy dog following anybody who is kind to him. It takes a passive character to achieve that. So while I think in some ways he's not the most endearing of characters, he's probably the character that needed to be had for the story that Scott wanted to tell. Then Scott writes another page on 'Tis 60 Years Since, and why he didn't choose a name like A Tale of the Old Days, and how he wanted to make it as clear as possible what this book is and what it isn't, for readers who just wouldn't have any clue. He does have a few interesting bits here. The object of my tale is more a description of men than manners. For that reason, he didn't want a story that was set too long ago, because then he'd have to do all the things that I've just done in the last video. He would have to describe the living conditions and the education and the assumptions they made, and the doings of the men would get lost among all that steep learning curve and the pacing issues it would create. So 60 years ago is a time that everyone would understand. If we read a book today set in 1960, it will be slightly different to the modern world, but close enough that we won't need any extra explanation. So that's what he's doing here. Instead of relying on the setting to supply all the interest, he's focusing on the aspects of humanity that are equally relevant to the past and the present. The passions, the motivations, the betrayals. But he did want there to be some kind of story to it, so he has chosen a historical event that he thinks will be of interest to everyone. That said, he's also rather concerned that he doesn't spoil the story, so he doesn't say anything more than this. And that's actually all there is to introductory, aka Chapter 1. We can move on to the proper start of the story. Chapter 2. This is the real beginning of the story, and I'm going over this chapter in immense detail. It's going to seem like overkill, but actually this chapter lays the groundwork for the whole novel. So I'm taking this chapter in much more detail than any other chapter in the book. I spent a bit of time working out how to approach this chapter. It is loaded with backstory, way too much of it, but it is all important to the story to come. Scott must have spent a long time planning this novel out before he started. Everything that's in here is relevant, is important, but there's just so much of it, it's hard to see what the importance is. So I spent some time thinking, how should I approach it? Because what I could do, I could just pull all that detail out and explain the chapter in the way that it really should be explained, in the way that a modern reader would expect it to be explained. I mean, I'm not saying I can do a better job than Scott, but he was brand new at the point that he wrote this. So it's not as nicely crafted as his later chapters. But then I decided, no, I want to actually talk about the structure, the way he actually put the parts of this novel together. So I'm going to go through as he wrote it, which may be slightly more confusing in some ways because he sort of tends to start at a point and then he goes back and then he goes back and then he comes forward and then he goes back a bit, and it could be worse. There were reasons. There were reasons why he approached it this way. So I'm actually just going to start with the first line and go through the way he intended. But before I do that, I'm going to present a picture. I said in a former video that I tended to people this book with images that I'd found on Wikimedia Commons. This is a habit I got from Penguin books because they did that. A lot of the early Penguin classics tended to have a painting, a portrait or something that wasn't actually related to the story, but it fitted the premise. It gave you clues about the setting, about the type of people, about the world that the story was set in. So I've sort of done the same. So here is my picture of Edward Waverley. This is a painting by Joseph Wall. It's titled Portrait of a Young Man, and it was painted in 1796. We don't know who that young man is, but to me, he epitomises Edward Waverley in this novel. There are many illustrations out there in the various editions of this book, but this is the closest match I've found to Scott's minimal descriptions of his hero. Every so often, as the story goes on, he mentions something about his character, some physicality that changed the way I viewed him. For instance, it's something like chapter 48 that he first mentions Edward Waverley's hair colour. And by then, I had this other idea of what his hair looked like. But having got to the end of the book, having read all of those descriptions, this character in this painting, I think, best fits. So from now on, I'm going to use this image for Edward Waverley. This shows the same type of dreamy manner that Edward Waverley has. Now, going on to the first line, I like what he's done here. He jumps straight into the story. It is then 60 years since Edward Waverley, the hero of the following pages, took leave of his family to join the regiment of dragoons in which he had lately obtained a commission. Even a modern reader learns a lot from this first sentence. Our main character is Edward Waverley, and he is a soldier. He's leaving his family to join his regiment. I'm going to unpack that just a bit more because a reader of 1814 gets more out of that sentence. Principally, that Edward Waverley has a commission. That means he's an officer. It also means he has connections and or money because commissions were purchased and they weren't cheap. When that sentence says obtained, it means bought, either by him or by someone with his interests at heart. And we further know that he does have good connections because he's going to a regiment of dragoons. There was a sort of hierarchy in the British regiments, and dragoons were up near the top. This is military aristocracy. They were cavalry, not foot soldiers. They had more expensive uniforms, social responsibilities, and greater expectations. The military was a world of its own back then. A reader would also note that Edward is saying goodbye to his family. He's not running away. He's not escaping into the military as many delinquents did. This is an honourable and responsible assignment for a young man of good family. That's sentence 1. There are only 2 sentences in the first paragraph, and they belong together, so here's the second. It was a melancholy day at Waverley Honour when the young officer parted with Sir Everard, the affectionate old uncle to whose title and estate he was presumptive heir. Waverley Honour is the name of the family estate. Most estates in England had names at this time. To put the word honour in the estate name, it's something of an affectation, even for England of this era. But it gives us a clue about the Waverley family. They're proud, they're principled, and we could actually infer that they're somewhat backward looking, because honour as a family concept is going to connect to legacy. These early chapters are full of metaphor. This was the 1804 beginning. And having read on now, I'm pretty sure this is blatantly suggesting that Edward is leaving honour behind. I'll come back to this soon. And then Scott talks about the family. There are 2 brothers, Sir Everard and Richard, and a sister Rachel, who isn't mentioned till later in the chapter. Everard is the eldest, hence him having the title and the estate. Richard is the youngest, and they have different political opinions. As a narrative technique, I like this. To explain why, I'm going to have to bring something in here that Scott leaves very vague, and that is that Edward Waverley is a very persuadable character. Maybe Scott wanted us to figure it out as we read, but I don't think so. I think it's just an oversight. I think he thought that this was obvious. He's crafted a very involved tale, and there are lots of elements. He just didn't realise it wasn't clear. It was obvious to him, he thought it would be obvious to us. So we've got our passive main character, Edward, easily convinced, an observer of the world, an innocent yet fervent follower of the most convincing argument, whatever that happens to be at the time. He's inspired by every story of chivalry, every suggestion of heroism. He's lonely, he's bored, he's imaginative, and he is highly impractical. And he's wavering. Politically, he has no opinion. Patriotically, he is undecided. Spiritually, he's one with the birds and the flowers and the babbling brook, and a church is just somewhere that pretty girls sometimes hang out. He's a friendly, gentle soul with no clue about the world outside of his own home. So narratively, the family circumstance fits. He has an uncle and a father with different political affiliations. He is heir to them both. As I said in the history video, this is a period where Protestant and Catholic were at odds. When the Stuart supporters who believed James II was wrongly ousted from the British throne are in silent opposition to the Hanover supporters, who accept that George II is their rightful king. Stuart supporters are effectively illegal. Catholics are effectively illegal. If you are either of these, you believe it in silence and say nothing. In this chapter, Scott talks about the hereditary faith of Sir Everard in High Church and the House of Stuart. So Sir Everard is a Stuart supporter. He's old money, he's established on the land, he's wealthy, he's got his house. The Waverleys managed to hang on to their property through the tumultuous 1500s and 1600s. Life is more stable now because the Hanover government have taken a gentler approach to this, a more subtle approach to routing out the remaining opposition. So he's established at Waverley Honour. Scott then tells us Richard entered life as an avowed Whig and a friend of the Hanover succession. So here's Edward, wavering between supporting the Stuarts or supporting the Hanovers. He has been raised in both traditions at once. He's wavering also between Catholicism, or at least High Anglicanism, and the Protestant Church of England, because Sir Everard is the High Church and Richard is Protestant. And he's further wavering between the political opinions of Whig and Tory, between supporting old traditions or embracing radical new developments. So in these days, in 1804, when Scott wrote this, these were his poetry days. And in poetry, you are very on the nose with your characters, with your actions. Everything is a metaphor. There's not many words. There's not much time to present your scenario. And I feel that he's doing the same in this book. In these early days, in 1804, as he's writing this first chapter, he's still got that in mind. That's how he's approaching this too. So here we are with Edward Waverley, who is kind of our everyman. I think that's how he intended him. He's the everyman who, at this point in time, has been presented with both political sides, with the past and the future. And I think Scott probably did choose him to sort of represent England at this time. It wasn't just a story. Because of the time he wrote, because everything had to be a bit didactic, Edward Waverley is sort of representing the non-political people of England at this time, who are just sort of sitting it out, going about their daily business, not realising that conflict could touch them personally at all. So at present, Waverley is accepting the best that both worlds have to offer. He's not even seeing the difference. He's in a peaceful home with a loving father and a loving uncle. They're not worlds apart at all. He's just living his own life, oblivious to all tension. But we, the reader, enlightened person of the world that we are, we know this ideal cannot continue. We know the real world will knock into Edward Waverley at some point. We know that he will have to choose one side or the other. So, what side will Edward Waverley choose? I see this as the thesis of the story. This is what Walter Scott is presenting to his reader. This is what we are meant to take out of this first chapter, and I don't think he managed it. It wasn't until I got to the end of the story, and I'm now rereading, that I can see this was his plan. What side will Edward Waverley choose? So after talking about the brothers, he gets into backstory. And there is a ton of it. Honestly, there is enough for a whole book on its own. I feel like that's what he should do. As somebody who has written myself, I made that same mistake too. It's so easy to develop a well-rounded character. You want to give them some backstory. You want to give them something that went before. But if it's too relevant to the story that you're telling now to be left out, then yeah, make it your own book. And that's probably what he should have done. But he didn't. And he didn't know it. And he didn't realise how much backstory he had given his main character. That's the rest of this chapter, and we need to know it. So I'll get into that. We learn that the parliamentary ministers at the time of George I wanted to, as Scott phrases it, diminish the phalanx of opposition, which means they're still on this mission to weed out all the Catholics and the Stuart supporters. As I said in the history video, there was a failed Jacobite rebellion in 1715, and George I was cluey enough to know that he had to continue the efforts of Mary, William and Anne and get rid of the rest of those insurrectionists. The 1715 rebellion showed that they still lived in the country, that even though they were quiet, even though they were dormant, they were still there and they could still rise up if war resumed. Now, this is in the past. This novel is set in 1745 in the time of George II. This bit in the chapter is about what happened in the time of George I, the previous king. So at this point, Everard and Richard are still young men. In those days, just as there are in these days, being 1745, but in those days, there was still a lot of wealthy country gentlemen who supported the Stuarts and hoped for another uprising. But George I's Parliament had to act legally. They were on shaky ground already because of the way George came to the throne and because of the way James II had been removed. It wasn't enough to just suspect somebody of being Jacobite. It wasn't enough even to know it. That was irrelevant if a Stuart supporter was obeying the law. So they were trying softer ways, such as promoting Hanover supporters to all the positions of trust. That meant that if you were a Whig like Richard Waverley, you had excellent promotion prospects in whatever career you chose. And that's what happened with Richard Waverley. Apparently, he went into politics. So, Richard Waverley has effectively set himself up to be his older brother's enemy. He's not precisely that, because the brothers do have some mutual respect for each other. But Richard's life choices have upset Sir Everard severely. And yet, at this time, Richard is likely to inherit Waverley Honour when Sir Everard dies, because Sir Everard is a single man with no children. To the Hanoverian parliamentarians, the accession of the near relation of one of those steady and inflexible opponents was considered as a means of bringing over more converts, meaning they hope Richard Waverley will convert the rest of his family to the proper side, especially since he is heir presumptive. For this reason, Richard has been promoted super fast. He's competent enough, but he's had a lightning rise to a very respectable position. This was the sort of thing that happened if you supported the right monarch. You could do really well, and Richard Waverley has. Everard's feelings on learning Richard's career choice are described in Chapter 1. He's deeply upset. His first thought is regarding the inheritance. I've explained in past videos, but this is worth mentioning again. The head of a house has a very particular role in England. He had obligations. It was a sacred trust. The house and land were not his own per se. They were held in trust for future generations, because it took several generations for a family to achieve greatness. The estate was the heart of the family, even of those who didn't live on it. It was the place the whole extended family could turn to for aid, for a bed if they needed one, for a loan if they needed money, for a reference, and it was up to that head of the household to manage the property so it could support everyone who needed support. So this isn't about Sir Everard's personal feelings. I mean, it is, because that's all he had to inform this decision, but he's making this call on behalf of all the Waverleys, past and present and future. Can Richard remain in the line of succession if he's become a Hanoverian? So Everard examined the tree of his genealogy, which, emblazoned with many an emblematic mark of honour and heroic achievement, hung upon the well-varnished wainscot of his hall. This is where we get the first little story of the Waverley ancestors. They're listed throughout because they mean so much to Everard and also somewhat to Edward. So at this point, with Sir Everard looking at the family tree, he's thinking about the lineage, he's thinking about Richard inheriting, and if it's not Richard, who can it be? Because remember, this is in the time of George I. They're both still young men. Edward hasn't been born yet. They're both single. Neither of them have an heir. So if it's not them, who can it be? And the only option is a very distant cousin who isn't even really a true Waverley. Everard calls his lawyer, as in he summons his lawyer to come and see him at the big house, and he nearly makes out a new will. There's a very good scene in Chapter 1 where Everard is sitting in his study and the lawyer is there, and the lawyer is he's mended his pen and he's just sitting there silently waiting. And Everard is thinking very deeply, still thinking very deeply. Everard is thinking that the distant cousin has a quartered coat of arms, which, long story, it just means he's combined his house with someone else's. It's not the pure thing. It's no longer pure. And a ray of sunlight comes through the window and falls on the Waverley coat of arms. And Everard sees this and he thinks, nope, I can't do this to the house. I can't let that cousin inherit, because if they do, Waverley, as we know it, is gone for good. The surname, the family, everything, the whole inheritance, the whole legacy. So he sends the lawyer away. That scene is a good indication of Walter Scott's skill. It's a momentous occasion. You feel all the tension, all the weight that Everard is giving to these momentous matters. He's someone to be trusted. He's not hasty. He takes all the care necessary. He acts for the good of the lineage and not from his own desires. So Everard then decided if he couldn't find an heir to replace Richard, he would have to produce one himself. This point in the story feels like meandering, but it's not. It actually comes back much later. It's a shame it's just buried in among all the other minutiae in this chapter. If you were making a movie out of this book, I'd say this should be the opening scene. You'd maybe start looking down at the Highlanders, sweep across the Scottish countryside into England, and then you'd pan in on Everard in his coach and six with his 4 liveried attendants, galloping across the countryside from Waverley Honour to visit some noble friend of his on the outskirts of the county. He has gone to visit a noble peer of untainted descent, steady Tory principles, and 6 unmarried and accomplished daughters. If this was a movie, you'd have this as a sort of montage. Everard would be explaining to the noble friend why he's there, that he needs to find a new heir. The noble friend welcomes him enthusiastically and says, "Any of my daughters, go and meet them, go and spend time with them. Let me know, they're all wonderful girls." And then Everard spends his time with the girls. They dine, he listens to them playing music, they walk in the garden, they do all the Jane Austen things. And he chooses the youngest. Her name is Emily, the Lady Emily. But Emily is very quiet, very reserved. Her mother tells him that's just Emily's way. Emily's just like that. But Everard feels that something's not quite right. And finally, Emily's elder sister tells him the story. How Emily is actually in love with a soldier. He's just a low-ranking soldier, so he couldn't possibly come and ask for her hand in marriage. But Emily loves him very much, and she doesn't dare defy her father so far as to explain this to Everard. Even without knowing any other purpose for this little interlude in the story, it does illustrate Everard's character, because at this point he withdraws his attentions from Emily. He's not going to ask her to marry him because he knows she is forced to say yes. He knows that she will have no choice but to say yes. So instead, he goes to her father and he explains this to him, and he says, "You must agree to their marriage." And when he convinces the noble, when Emily and her soldier have gotten married, he then goes home and quietly purchases a commission for this soldier as an officer. Through the next 30 years, because it's 30 years between then and now nearly, through all of that time, Everard has been acting as patron to this soldier, helping him in his career, making sure that he's got what he needs, buying him promotions at the right times, so that the soldier and Emily are happy. He does this almost secretly. For a while it is secret, but he certainly doesn't explain any of this to Richard or any of this to Edward. It just goes to illustrate his character. There is no resentment in Sir Everard Waverley at all. He's not that sort of person. He is a big-hearted man. Proud, he's stoic, but he's gentle, he's kind, he's very loving. You'd never know it because he doesn't really show it. But that's who he is. That is Sir Everard. But he did take the disappointment to heart. He never does marry, which is not a trope I like, but it does actually fit his character. There are very few people who it would fit. It's not that he's pining for Emily forever. He does just move on with his life, but having put himself in that position once, it was disagreeable. He felt pretty awful for her. He felt pretty awful himself, and he just doesn't see any reason to put himself through that again. So he doesn't. He doesn't need to. He's comfortable in his life at Waverley Honour. And his sister, I mentioned a sister earlier, Rachel. His sister Rachel lives there with him. They are both unmarried, so they both sort of just keep each other company and live their own lives at Waverley Honour. Several years pass, and we're still in this chapter, chapter 2. Edward and Richard are completely estranged. Now, Richard gets married to a woman who is never named, I guess because it's not relevant to the story. Richard had married a young woman of rank, by whose family interest and private fortune he hoped to advance his career, which makes it sound like he married for money, for what she had to offer, but not for her herself. I don't know if that's how it's meant to come across, but that's how it does to me. And in her right, he became possessor of a manor of some value, just a few miles away from Waverley Honour. So Everard and Richard actually live in different mansions just a few miles apart. So Richard's wife inherits a small manor house just down the road from Waverley Honour. It is a mansion, it's a decent-sized property, but it's modest compared to Waverley Honour. Edward is born and Mrs. Waverley is conveniently fridged. I mean, she dies, and we never even got to know her name. So now we've got Everard in the big house and Richard and Edward living just down the street. Everard and Richard are still not talking, and Edward is a child at this time. Everard has no idea that they're living there, as far as I can tell. I mean, maybe someone told him, but I think everybody knows they're estranged. And I don't think anybody else would raise the subject. So unless someone told Rachel and then she found the time to tell him. If Everard knows that Richard's there, he's wiped him out of his life. They're not connected anymore. And then we have another of these great little cameo scenes that Scott is so good at. In this scene, child Edward, he's aged about 5, is out walking with his nurse, and they come across Sir Everard's carriage. The carriage is parked outside a farming house. Everard is visiting this farmer and they're discussing building something somewhere. So Everard is inside the property, which is sort of it's not a rustic farmhouse. This is still a proper house. He's like the squire, this guy. Everard is in there visiting him, and the man is there and his wife and all his little kids, and Everard is looking at all these little kids and he's thinking how fun it would have been to be a father, and it would be so cool to have little kids like this running around. He is a bit lonely, and he is a very big-hearted man, and he did have a lot of love to give if only he had found a wife and raised a family. So that's what he's doing. He's thinking, and outside, little Edward and his nurse come down the road, see the carriage. Edward is really impressed. Now, Edward also, because he's a bright child, we are told this. You don't see many signs of this. According to me, you don't see many signs of this in Edward through the years. But Edward is a bright child, and Edward is wearing a tie. He's wearing a Waverley tie. Edward knows the coat of arms quite well. There are instances of this around his own home, obviously. When he sees this carriage, it's got the coat of arms on the side, and he recognises it as his own coat of arms. He's just a child. He doesn't really understand what's going on. But he points to it and he says, "That's mine." And he's wearing a tie at the moment, and he knows that this little tie, he's wearing a tie that has the coat of arms on it right this minute. And that's his because he is Edward Waverley, so anything in the house with a coat of arms is going to come to him. And this is his child understanding of heraldry. So he sees this coach. It's got the same coat of arms. He says, "That's mine." And the nurse is not able to pull him away. So he's still there. He goes over to it. He is looking at the horses and he's saying, "They're mine. They're all mine." And he's looking at it all, not really understanding, when Everard comes out of the house, still feeling really sentimental, having seen all these children and feeling on his own. Everard looks at the child, sees the tie he's wearing, and realises who he is, or realises who he must be. And it's a really happy meeting because Everard is his heart has been softened at this moment, and he's thinking, this child is like me, not like his father, because he's wearing the tie. He's got all the interest in the heraldry. He's looking at just the way he's saying, "This is mine." Everard is thinking, there's something in this. This child is my own blood. This child might be the future of Waverley. So Everard drives him home, and while Everard and Richard don't really make it up, the rift isn't made up, they sort of become cordial to each other rather than completely distant. And Everard invites Edward to come round and visit Waverley Honour. And so this starts a system that continues as Edward grows up, of Edward visiting. He lives with his dad at this lodge whose name I've completely forgotten. Something like Brerewood Lodge, it's something like that. He lives with his dad there, but he goes to stay at Waverley Honour, where he meets his Aunt Rachel and he learns things from his uncle Everard. And he becomes a sort of connecting bridge between the two estranged brothers, who over time, Richard actually doesn't try to impose. He's thinking to himself, never going to forgive him, but this isn't a bad position, and it's good if Edward can inherit Waverley Honour. He would be secure, his future would be secure. So Richard just thinks, I'll just stay out of it, I won't stir the pot. If he invites me to do anything else, I'll respond, but I won't initiate anything. So as Edward grew up, that's just how it is. And Edward, being a child who sort of accepts what he sees, he just doesn't think much about this rift between his father and his uncle. He just takes it as the way of the world. And that's the end of the chapter. So to come back to my former point, and I just think I need to conclude this with that, I can see what this chapter was trying to do. I can see how this chapter was trying to lay out Edward Waverley's position between the two sides. He probably thought he brought that out clearly. And I'm absolutely sure the main thesis of this book is, what will Edward Waverley choose? And as we go through, if you're laying that out in chapter 1, then the reader knows we're actually going to see both sides. Now, the reader also knows, presumably, the reader is likely to be British. So the reader will know the British side best. So he is going to see a bit of the other side. He's going to see what influences Edward Waverley that will allow him to weigh up the merits of the Stuarts versus the merits of the Hanoverians, the Catholics versus the Protestants, to work out what really matters to humanity, what really matters to a country, what principles he's going to end up with. This is what the book is about. And I suspect when he gave this work to his critiquer, this is the thing, he thought it was so clear, but the critiquer also didn't pull this out. It was just looking like a sequence of events, just an account of activities that happen. It's very hard to wade through all of the information in the way it's presented to figure out that there is some kind of greater theme in the background. And the greater theme isn't which is better. It's not, should it be the Stuarts or the Hanoverians? It's nothing like that. It is simply, what will Edward Waverley choose? Given his very open view of both sides, he hasn't been raised with any sort of prejudice. He hasn't been raised with any preconceived notions. He's seen the best of both sides in the people in his world. And if you come to Waverley thinking that, it gives the reader something to do. It gives the reader some way to interpret everything that happens to him, all his wild meanderings, all the people that he meets that just don't seem to matter to the story. But if you can hold that question in mind, that somewhere down the line he will have to choose. He can't jump from side to side the way he's doing. Nobody can. No Englishman can. Nobody can get all the way through their life without having to form some philosophy to guide their decisions. And this is Edward's time to do it. So on that note, on that complicated note, we can just move on into a bit more story. There's a few more chapters of like looking in the past and discussing various aspects, but this is the heaviest chapter in the book. This is the one that sort of lays out, as I said, all that groundwork. This sets the scenario. With that under our belts, it's much easier to move on. So that's chapter 2, ready to move on.